Good morning, everyone. We're going to continue hearing opening statements from various core participants, and this morning we're going to begin with Mr. Menon, who's appearing on behalf of Mr. Kabide. That's right. Yes, Mr. Menon.
Good morning. Bahailu Kabede had been living in flat 16 on the 4th floor of Grenfell Tower for some 25 years, where not long before 1 a.m., on the 14th of June last year, he was awoken by a beeping sound. It was coming from the kitchen. He realized it must be the smoke alarm. He opened the kitchen door and looked inside for just a few seconds. What he saw was smoke. It seemed to be coming from behind his hot point fridge freezer. It seemed to be spreading upward and outward. He did not see any flames. Mr. Kabede acted quickly and instinctively. He grabbed his mobile phone from the living room and dialed 999. He was not able to connect immediately. He had to make a number of calls before he was actually able to speak to an operator. Meanwhile, he banged on the bedroom doors of his flatmates, Almaz Kinfu and Elsa Afewaki, and shouted, "Fire, fire, fire." He then banged on the front doors of the 5 other flats on the 4th floor. He waited until somebody opened each door and again shouted, "Fire, fire, fire." Having warned all his neighbors on the 4th floor, Mr. Kabede returned to flat 16, switched off the main electricity switch in the hallway, and put on some trousers. He left his home for the very last time, shutting the front door behind him. All he had on his person were the clothes he was wearing and the mobile phone with which he was calling 999. He left barefoot without any shoes. He left without his wallet, his flat keys, and his car keys. He took the stairs down and exited the building. He did not pack a suitcase and leave with it after raising the alarm, a nasty lie that was first reported in the days after the fire and sadly continues to be peddled nearly a year later, most recently in a lengthy article called "The Tower," published in the 7th of June 2018 issue of the London Review of Books. In short, Bahailu Kabede did exactly what Grenfell Tower residents who discovered a fire in their flat were told to do by the fire action notice posted outside the lifts. He telephoned the fire brigade on 999 and informed the operator that there was a fire at flat 16, Grenfell Tower, London W11 1TG. He left his flat promptly, shutting the door behind him, and he used the stairs to go down and exit the building. Indeed, Mr. Kabede went further than the fire action notice instructed. To his enormous credit, he also made sure that everybody else on the 4th floor had been warned about the fire, and only when he believed that nobody else was left on the floor did he himself leave and make his way downstairs. When he got outside, Mr. Kabede anxiously awaited the arrival of the fire brigade. When they got there soon after, he immediately told a firefighter what he had seen in his kitchen. A number of firefighters then entered the tower and headed upstairs for the 4th floor. To his horror, Mr. Kabede watched as a few minutes later, and despite the efforts of the firefighters, the fire managed to exit his flat in the vicinity of the kitchen window, take hold of the external facade, and spread upwards on the east side of the building with great speed and fury. Mr. Kabede took a number of photographs and videos on his mobile phone, all of which he later gave the police. He desperately wanted to do more to help his neighbors and friends. But what practically could he do? He felt utterly helpless. Subsequently, as we know, the fire continued to grow and spread on all four sides, externally and internally, eventually consuming the entire building. Later that morning, Mr. Kebede received a phone call from the police asking him to attend the police station for interview. Notwithstanding that he had just had the most shocking, frightening, and traumatic experience of his life, he did not hesitate and went straight to the police station and answered all their questions in the course of 2 separate interviews. Since then, he has been approached on a number of further occasions by the police and has fully cooperated at all times. It is important to stress, given all the garbage that has been written about him this past year, that Mr. Kebede is a significant witness in the police investigation and not a criminal suspect. In the days following the fire at Grenfell Tower, whilst trying to comprehend the enormity of what had transpired, whilst trying to grieve for his friends and neighbors who had perished in the fire, whilst trying to cope with increasing distress, anxiety, trauma, and insomnia, whilst trying to allay the understandable feelings of guilt he was experiencing, given the fire had seemingly started in his kitchen, Mr. Kebede was subjected to a campaign of what can only be described as harassment by sections of the media. Journalists turned up at his partner's home, trying to doorstep him. He was bombarded with calls and texts from journalists offering him large amounts of money to sell his story. Even his Facebook friends were offered money to facilitate a meeting with him. When he refused to engage with the media or accept their money, old photos of him taken years ago, whilst he was on holiday, were downloaded from Facebook and reproduced in several tabloid newspapers without any explanation, as if he was enjoying himself in the aftermath of the fire. There was one particularly offensive article in the Daily Mail that seemed to scapegoat Mr. Kebede for the fire itself. Within 24 hours, that one article was the subject of over 1,000 complaints to the press watchdog from members of the public. The calamitous events at Grenfell Tower and the subsequent media intrusion have had serious consequences for Mr. Kebede and his family. His partner and children felt unsafe in their home and were forced to move out. The police were so concerned about Mr. Kebede's safety that they suggested witness protection, relocation, and a change of name. And without going into any detail, Mr. Kebede's health has been so severely affected that he feels terrified, and I use that word advisedly, terrified, about the prospect of being compelled to give oral evidence to this inquiry. Consequently, we are most grateful for the indication that Mr. Millett gave in his opening statement that Mr. Kebede's lengthy written witness statement will be read into the record in a fortnight's time, and unless it proves necessary and his health permits it, Mr. Kebede will not be required to give oral evidence in September when the other bereaved survivors and residents are called. Finally, on the topic of media intrusion, following the playing of the 999 call that he made on Monday, there has been a renewed injection of press and public interest in Mr. Kebede. The same photographs of Mr. Kebede have been used yet again. Can I please use this opportunity to ask everyone, but in particular the press, to leave Mr. Kebede alone? He is a good man. He did nothing wrong. On the contrary, he did the right thing from start to finish. Now he wants privacy for himself and his family. He just wants to be given the opportunity to try and rebuild his life as best as he can. Now, before I move on and make some observations about the inquiry, it's important that I address and clarify several matters about Mr. Kabede's long life at Grenfell Tower before the fire changed his life forever. Prior to the refurbishment that began in 2012, Mr. Kabede loved living at Grenfell Tower. It was his first real home in the UK after he moved here from Ethiopia. He was so happy to be given accommodation by the council. He loved the strong bonds between the tower's residents who came from all parts of the world. He loved the neighborhood. He loved his spacious flat. He took great pride in furnishing it himself. The refurbishment, however, was another matter altogether. Mr. Kabede was not happy, and nobody he knew in the tower was happy. There was no consultation. There were many problems and complaints. Mr. Kabede personally had problems with incorrectly fitted double-glazed windows that left gaps between the frames and the concrete, and with the removal of his old boiler and the installation of his new one. Many of his neighbors experienced multiple electrical problems that were apparently due to power surges. Mr. Kabede attended a number of residents' meetings in the community hall next to the tower and elsewhere. What he never knew, however, was that a highly flammable fuel had been used to insulate and clad the exterior of the tower as part of the refurbishment. Much has been written and said about Mr. Kabede's hot point fridge freezer. Conspiracy theories and rumors abound. So let me make the position absolutely clear. There are 7 points I wish to make. 1, Mr. Kabede bought the fridge freezer brand new over 5 years before the fire. 2, other than when the fridge freezer needed defrosting, it never caused him any problems. 3, he never had to get it repaired by anybody else. Neither did he ever repair it or try to repair it himself. 4, any speculation to the effect that the fridge freezer had been tampered with or subjected to an unauthorized DIY repair is palpable nonsense. 5, whatever the precise cause or origin of the fire in Mr. Kabede's kitchen, it was accidental, and Mr. Kabede bears no responsibility, directly or indirectly, for the fire, its spread, or the dreadful consequences that followed. 6, if the fire did begin in the fridge freezer, it is worth noting that, contrary to popular belief, accidental fires in fridges and freezers are not uncommon. Every year in the UK, there are around 300 domestic fires involving a fridge or a freezer, with a number of common failures within the appliances leading to ignition. In a particularly tragic case in 2011, 6 members of a family of 8, including 5 children, died in a fire at their home in Neasden when the capacitor adjacent to the compressor in their Whirlpool freezer failed and caught fire. 7, and finally, the consumer body Which has recently carried out the largest industry-wide investigation in the UK into fridges and freezers on the market, and found that many of the most popular products are potentially unsafe and could put lives at risk. The London Fire Brigade has also stated that many manufacturers are still dragging their heels on making fire safety improvements to fridges and freezers. In the circumstances, we entirely agree with Mr. Millett that in many respects, the cause and origin of the fire may not be of primary importance, and that the more pressing question from the perspective of the public interest and public safety is how the fire penetrated the exterior envelope of the building from Mr. Kabede's kitchen and thereafter spread so rapidly and ferociously. We hope that Dr. Duncan Glover's report on the electric appliances in Flat 16, including the Hotpoint fridge freezer, will put this matter to rest once and for all. Turning then to the inquiry. Unsurprisingly, Mr. Kabede's hopes are similar to those of the other bereaved survivors and residents. They are similar to what was so movingly and powerfully articulated by so many who spoke during the commemorations. The commemorations, we must not forget, when first proposed by lawyers for the bereaved, were met in some quarters with skepticism and even opposition, but ultimately they were embraced and rightly put the bereaved and the survivors at the very heart of this inquiry. Mr. Kabede hopes that the inquiry, having heard all the evidence, will deliver real justice for the 72 who died, their families, and those who survived the fire, and real accountability. He hopes that despite being prohibited from determining criminal or civil liability, the inquiry will nevertheless make decisive findings and recommendations that will allow others to infer such liability, decisive findings as to which corporate and governmental core participants were responsible for those aspects of the refurbishment that transformed Grenfell Tower into what has been properly characterized by others as a highly combustible death trap. Decisive findings as to which corporate and governmental core participants caused or contributed to an entirely foreseeable and preventable catastrophe in which a fire confined to a single compartment within the building was able to spread so easily and so quickly in multiple directions inside and outside the building with such devastating consequences. On a more personal note, sir, Mr. Kabede hopes that having heard all the evidence, the inquiry will make a clear and unequivocal statement that Mr. Kabede was absolutely blameless for the outbreak of the fire, its spread, and its fatal consequences. This is vitally important. If the inquiry does not explicitly exonerate Mr. Kabede, all the sleazy accusations and hurtful innuendo, all the racist assumptions and ignorance about Mr. Kabede that currently prevail will continue unabated. The inquiry needs to set the record straight. The inquiry needs to change the narrative about Behailu Kabede. The inquiry needs to thank Mr. Kabede for his prompt effort that he made on the night to contact the fire brigade, raise the alarm, and warn his neighbors. Sitting on the fence in respect of Mr. Kabede with the greatest respect will not do. In 2013, The Guardian published an article by a leading commentator entitled "Politicians Who Demand Inquiries Should Be Taken Out and Shot." In short, the article argued that inquiries defer blame. They throw the ball into the long grass and kick the can down the road. They merely replace the straight, sure arrow of accountability with a crooked line of pseudo-justice. They are the establishment's get-out-of-jail card. On behalf of Behailu Kabede, we hope that these words are not prophetic and that the author of this article is wrong insofar as the inquiry into the Grenfell Tower fire is concerned. So far, the governmental and corporate core participants whose conduct is under scrutiny, who are in the frame for criticism, so to speak, have been playing games with the inquiry. They have been getting away, to be frank, with daylight robbery. Some have disengaged or barely engaged, as if by doing so they might slip through the net. Those who have engaged have served mealy-mouthed position statements and opening statements that say nothing of real value. None of them have taken any responsibility whatsoever for their role in the creation of the highly combustible death trap that was the refurbished Grenfell Tower. Their strategy is clear. Keep your head down, say as little as possible, express sympathy, admit nothing, pass the buck, pretend it is all very complicated, minimize reputational damage and financial loss. Enough, we say, enough. The time has come for action. The time has come to take away, by any means necessary and available to this inquiry, the get-out-of-jail card that has been played so ruthlessly until now. Otherwise, the inquiry, like the Dame Hackett review, will prove another wasted opportunity, if not worse. Finally, I turn to Mr. Khan's bold submission yesterday that the terms of reference of the inquiry should be extended to include consideration of whether race, religion, or social class had any bearing on what led to the loss of life at Grenfell Tower. There was a tangible discomfort in the room yesterday when Mr. Khan spoke about race and class, the proverbial elephant in the room. For what it's worth, we agree with Mr. Khan. However, given your refusal in August last year, sir, to broaden the scope of the inquiry, despite widespread support from those most affected by the fire, we are realistic about the prospects of you changing your mind now. At the end of the day, whether you alter the terms of reference or not, there are certain stark, irrefutable facts that one simply cannot ignore about the underlying social, economic, and political reality and conditions that culminated in 71 people dying from smoke and fire in a high-rise residential building, and a 72nd person dying a few months later in one of the richest boroughs, in one of the world's great cities, in one of the richest countries in the 21st century. It is no coincidence that this fire occurred in a building consisting of social housing and former social housing purchased under the Right to Buy scheme, and not in one of the many posh, swanky, high-rise residential buildings around London that cater to the extremely wealthy. It is no coincidence that this fire occurred in a building owned by a Tory flagship borough that has been at the forefront of promoting austerity, cuts and deregulation, and prioritizing business and profit over health and safety.
Justice for Grenfell.
Just a minute. That's the first occasion on which anyone has thought it right to try and interrupt the proceedings. Now, you all know that so far these proceedings have been conducted with a great deal of dignity and sensitivity on the part of all those in the hearing room. And I expect it to continue in that way, and I'm not willing to tolerate shouting, calling out, or anything else from those in the room. I say it now because it's the first occasion on which it's happened, but I want to make that very clear. Out of respect for the proceedings and for the person addressing me, and to enable me to understand clearly what's being said, it's essential that you all keep yourselves under control and hear the speaker in silence. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, Mr. Menon, continue.
It is no coincidence that the vast majority of the residents of Grenfell Tower were first or second generation migrants and refugees, the remaining residents being largely local people with long-standing roots in the North Kensington area. Amongst the 72 who died, 23 different countries or more were represented. So race and class are at the heart of the Grenfell story, whether we like it or not, whether the inquiry acknowledges it or not, whether the terms of reference are extended or not. Consequently, we say what happened at Grenfell Tower in the early hours of the 14th of June last year was as political as it gets and symbolic of a deep inequality in our society. This inquiry must speak truth to power and hold those responsible accountable. Anything less would be an insult to the bereaved and the survivors. Thank you.
Thank you very much. No, I'm sorry, we don't have applause either. These are formal proceedings. We just listen quietly and let the speaker take his course. No, thank you very much, Mr. Menon. Mr. Thomas, I think you're going to address us next. Is that right? Yes, when you're ready.
As long as poverty, injustice, and gross inequality persist in our world, none of us can truly rest. Those are the words of Nelson Mandela. I'd like to take this opportunity, if I may, to offer my personal condolences to everyone touched by this tragedy. Also to my brave clients, I know you carry a heavy burden, and I'm here to share that burden with you. Sir, I am instructed on behalf of 23 clients, including survivors, bereaved, family members and loved ones. The various firms of solicitors who instruct me are Duncan Lewis, Hudgell Solicitors, Janes Solicitors and Saunders Solicitors. Assisting me are Junior Counsel Ms. Thalia Mirage and Mr. Jamie Burton, and I thank them for their assistance with this opening statement. This opening statement is made on behalf of the deceased, survivors, families and victims in the group known as G10. Mr. Mike Mansfield of Queen's Counsel will also be addressing you, sir. We have ensured that our topics do not overlap. Too many tears have been shed since the tragedy of this fire on the 14th of June of last year. Many tears were shed last week during the pen portraits. No doubt, by the end of this inquiry, enough will have been shed for a mighty river of sorrow to flow. Lost lives, lost loves, lost opportunities. We do not want one tear to have been shed in vain. We do not want one life to have been wasted without proper recourse to justice. We do not want one soul to have been lost to this world without any meaning. So, on behalf of the families, the survivors, the dead, we will not permit or stand idly by and allow the wretched souls lost on that fateful night to have passed without a proper accounting for their lives, which were prematurely extinguished by toxic smoke, fumes and fire. Chairman, you and your team have to understand, as I'm sure you do, that our duty is to those who died, those who survived, their families, their loved ones and their friends, but also to the wider community, because they collectively demand of us to pursue doggedly, fearlessly and determinedly the truth, the whole truth, and nothing less than the truth as to what happened on that night. So, sir, have no doubt dangerous practices will be exposed in this inquiry, and we hope that you and your team will have the courage to stand alongside us to expose wrongdoing where wrongdoing exists. To that end, we want this inquiry to focus on the recent refurbishment to and the cladding of the building, the inadequacies of the fire measures, the gross mismanagement of the building by Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organisation, that's a mouthful, so I'm going to refer to them as KCTMO, and others. And also, but not least, the treatment of ordinary citizens by what I will describe as the corporates and public bodies alike. Let me turn to the firefighters. There has, in the openings by others, been criticisms of the firefighters' capabilities and their reaction on the night. That is something that undoubtedly will be considered. However, we must not lose sight of the primary issues. Let's turn to them. The refurbishment. We say this, that those responsible for allowing this situation to get to the stage where 72 souls were lost in the most horrendous and awful way should hang their heads in collective shame. Not only was there the tragedy of death, but also let us not forget that many people were injured both physically and mentally, and an entire community became homeless from this building and the surrounding area. There are many important questions that arise. Needless to say, it is absolutely imperative that this inquiry identifies the failures that caused the loss of life and the terrible harm to others. Equally important, all those responsible must be held to account. One of our clients said that the refurbishment changed the building from being an ugly, safe council block to a death trap that looked like a pretty private block. Whilst those responsible for the refurbishment may dispute just how unsafe they made Grenfell Tower, it is incontrovertible that the tower was intentionally rendered significantly less safe by the introduction of highly flammable material to its structure and exterior. We do not yet know everything about what happened, but it would seem that this fact was never communicated to the London Fire Brigade. The fire safety of several hundred people deliberately compromised in their own homes, and yet the public servants ultimately responsible for protecting them in the event of fire are simply never told, still less consulted. Moreover, sir, as Barbara Lane notes, at no time did an independent public official interrogate and conduct due diligence of the corporate decision-making that ultimately led inexorably and predictably to the prioritisation of profit over safety. Leaving aside for now any ambiguities in the regulatory regime and the culpability of those involved, this is an alarming state of affairs. By design, complacency, error, or all of these, the state palpably failed in its primary duty to protect its citizens. And as for the corporates, silence speaks 1,000 words. The state may have failed to protect the residents of Grenfell from dangerous cost cuts and penny pinching, but have no doubt the inquiry will not stop there, for we shall not let it. Any attempt to mislead, distract, rewrite history, or blame others in an attempt to conceal the truth will be met with unwavering resistance. Sir, once you've heard the evidence, you may have conclude that for too long, representatives of the corporate sector have encountered a state too willing to bow to their demands, too susceptible to manipulation in favour of their interests, unwilling or ill-equipped to stand firm behind the public interest in the face of corporate greed. The state has permitted a culture of corporate impunity to take root. Sir, whilst the extinction of this culture is beyond the powers of any single person or any judge, you and your team can surely contribute to its dismantling by joining us in ensuring that by holding those responsible for this terrible fire, this inquiry marks the beginning of the end. The warnings from the occupants and mismanagement, if I can turn to that. The role of KCTMO is significant. It had accepted a management role and was funded by the local authority. The failure of KCTMO to engage with the residents of Grenfell Tower and action their concerns about the safety of the building exemplifies this erosion of the state's social obligation to the residents. In March 2017, Mr. Shah Ahmed, the chair of the Leaseholders Association, asked the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea to conduct a full health and safety audit of Grenfell. He delivered a full dossier to Kensington and Chelsea just 2 weeks before the fire. He repeatedly asked KCTMO to provide and carry out a fire drill and queried the absence of any fire safety advice for the residents of the tower. The Grenfell Fire Tower is what happens when ordinary people are ignored. It is a direct consequence of that failing. Proper participation in this inquiry, if I can turn to that. Allied to this, we trust and hope that during this inquiry, we, that is the lawyers representing the families, the survivors, the dead, will be permitted to ask proper and relevant questions. And we are mindful to remind this inquiry that should the residents, bereaved and survivors not be allowed to ask proper and relevant questions through and by their own counsel, this inquiry has the danger of having the perception of becoming a whitewash. If the residents, bereaved and survivors are told, you cannot ask questions through your own lawyers in this inquiry, that perception will be perpetuated. A powerless group of people will be rendered a voiceless group of people. Insult will be added to grave injury. A group that should be at the centre of this inquiry will find themselves at the periphery, marginalised, once again, ignored. Sir, it is in your power, your gift to grant this. Remember, sir, that these good people were not listened to when their justifiable and legitimate concerns were raised, and they seek your reassurance that the mistakes of the past will not be repeated here. But sir, you need not worry. The questions that we will ask will not be repetitious or irrelevant. I assure you they will be pointed, proper and pertinent. It is important that our clients feel and see that they have equality of arms in this hearing. Your trust in us will not be abused. The stigmatisation of social housing, if I can turn to that. Sir, I wonder if you will permit me to share with you one of life's ironies, coincidences, or some may well say quirks. It may not have escaped your attention that I am of African Caribbean descent. Both my parents were part of that Windrush generation that came here to the UK in the very early 60s as British dependents to assist in the rebuilding of the motherland, looking to improve their own lives, to create opportunities for their children, of which I'm very grateful to my mum and dad for. Many of the Grenfell occupants made similar journeys, like my parents. My parents came from different Caribbean islands and met in West London. They fell in love there. Their first home in this country was on the Latimer Road, within a stone's throw of the site where Grenfell Tower would later be constructed. They would later move to Talbot Road, just off Portobello Road, which is where I was born. Our landlord at the time was a gentleman known as Mr. Ackman. Sir, in the 50s and 60s, this was a time where if you were a person of colour, it was extremely difficult to secure decent rented accommodation in the private sector. Rental advertisements and signs in people's windows were not particularly inviting or welcoming. Adverts were common, room to let, but no blacks, no Irish, no dogs. Remember, this was a time before this country had proper and effective anti-discrimination laws. Not all private landlords were unwilling to rent to people of colour. For some, the colour of your money was more important than the colour of your skin. However, with very little housing rights to tenants, many of the properties rented were not particularly fit for habitation or were in a poor state of repair. And tenants, particularly if you were a tenant of colour, you had to tolerate this if you wanted to keep a roof over your head. Social housing outside the private sector was therefore extremely important for all people, and in particular for people of colour. Because if you were a person of colour, sir, market choice was limited. It became vital. Life coincidences do not stop there. My parents were married in the local Notting Hill Methodist Church that now stands in the shadows of Grenfell. So I'm sure you know that this is the very church which is doing such great work under the stewardship of the Reverend Mike Long and other community leaders for many of the victims of Grenfell and the local community. At this very moment, there is a live link in the church showing these proceedings. And that is the very same church where I was baptised at the tender age of 3 months old. So yes, I was born in the Grenfell area, although at the time of my birth, the tower had yet to be constructed. That would not happen until, I believe, 1974. So in a way, this case, this tragedy, this devastation resonates with me on a very personal level. Sir, there is no inherent problem with tower blocks. They are the foundation of many strong neighbourhoods and communities. People enjoy living in them. Grenfell Tower was part of a strong and vibrant community in the Lancaster West Estate and North Kensington. The problem is with poorly maintained tower blocks. We want to be clear that it is important not to stigmatise social housing or the people who live in social housing. Social housing is necessary for the provision of accommodation in this country, and the notion that the residents of Grenfell Tower deserved less and they were lesser citizens because they lived in social housing, well, that simply needs to be debunked. This stigma, which undoubtedly exists, reflects recent political attitudes towards council housing and council tenants. Did you know, in 1975, more than a third of the population was housed in council housing? This was a major achievement in the post-war reconstruction and improvement of pre-war housing conditions. It benefited the lives of many people. But a change was to come. By 1980, a rise in home ownership was promoted by the introduction of the tenant's right to buy council housing, which of itself is unproblematic. However, the sale of council housing was accompanied by the simultaneous imposition of serious restrictions on the ability of councils to replenish their stock. That process continued with the forced privatisation of much council housing across the country and the increased commodification of housing generally. Owning one's home was no longer enough. One had to get onto the housing ladder. A home has become not only a place in which to live, but an investment opportunity. Transfer of public housing stock into private hands and simultaneously making the remaining council less well supported and appealing as an option. Of course, the inquiry will know that the stereotype does not match the reality of Grenfell Tower. This inquiry knows that the occupants of Grenfell Tower and the estate of which it was a part were mixed and as varied as the population of the great city in which we all live. A significant number of people in the tower owned their own homes. But the perception, sir, was still there. Council housing is for those who fail in life, people who need to be managed, not embraced or admired, desperate people without the agency to improve their lives, the destitute, the disenfranchised, vulnerable and voiceless. Descriptions not of people themselves, but of what society has done to them. This attitude and stereotyping is what allowed the cost-cutting and the deadly materials to become normalised. It also led to some appalling and false media reporting after the event, which exemplified the prejudice against those people who were living in council housing and tower blocks. But I call prejudice that is based on socio-economic status. It is all based on false stereotypes and stigmatisation. It is deeply cultural as well as social. This inquiry is, of course, not only a legal process, but a cultural and social event, whether or not that fact is fully embraced by this inquiry. It is imperative that the inquiry does not even inadvertently confirm the stereotypes around council housing, even when expressing sympathy with the victims of the fire. They were not helpless. They were just not helped. In concrete terms, the inquiry can also contribute to the minimising the impact of the socio-economic disadvantage by recommending that Section 1 of the Equalities Act 2010 is finally brought into force, the public sector socio-economic duty. Had it been enforced, sir, at the time of the refurbishment, It would have required the public bodies to have been involved in the refurbishment of Grenfell Tower to explain at the time why it was considered acceptable to recklessly cut costs when refurbishing a publicly owned building in the richest borough in the sixth richest country in the world. Legacy beyond the council housing and fire risks, if I can turn to that. This inquiry's legacy can and should go beyond a focus on fire safety in tower blocks, essential as that is. The inquiry stands in a unique and unprecedented position to recommend that the right to adequate housing is enshrined in our law. It is a fact that the residents' concerns about the building in which they lived were not reflected in their legal rights. Despite paying their rent, they had absolutely no private law right to live in a safe and habitable home, free from imminent destruction. Surprising as that may well be. But they only had a right to a home in a state of repair, and their ability to enforce even that right was undermined by the scarcity of legal aid. This must change. More than anything, the Grenfell Tower disaster was a profound breach of the universal human right to an adequate home. Unfortunately, whilst long since recognised as a human right in international law, successive UK governments have refused to incorporate the right into our domestic law and allow our courts to uphold it. An adequate home is one that is not only in a state of repair, but also where the physical safety of the occupants is guaranteed. There can be little doubt that had the residents of Grenfell Tower been able to directly enforce their rights to an adequate home in court, then at least some of the fire risks that now we know were present on the 14th of June 2017 would have been identified and rectified before they came to pass with such awful consequences. An enforceable right to housing would ensure that this most basic of necessities for a fulfilling and healthy life would be protected for all, whatever the shortcomings in the law, policy or practice that regulates housing in this country. It would provide the ultimate fallback position. The inquiry stands in a unique and unprecedented position to recommend that the right to adequate housing is enshrined, and we commend that to you, sir. The people in the Grenfell community. It is important to remember that the people who lived in the tower block are not members of a homogenised group or homogenous group. They are reflective of the wider society and hard-working people who make a valuable contribution to our society. Ahmed, the son of Elsa and brother of Mariam, said this: "There is a misconception that those living in social housing are simply a group of uneducated and second-class citizens that should be thankful for living in the royal borough of Kensington and Chelsea." However, the reality of the lives of many of the residents of Grenfell Tower shows otherwise. Gloria Trevisan was an architect. Mohammed Nida had his own chauffeur business for the last 10 to 15 years of his life. His son, Farhad Nida, graduated from Kingston University with a Bachelor in Science and Engineering. Mary Mendy was a carer and worked in the community. Her daughter Kajida was a talented artist at the very start of a very promising career. Pilly Burton worked as a contract manager for several years for several hospitals in and around the area. Debbie Lamprell worked in the Holland Park Opera House. Hamid Khani was a talented chef. And it goes on. The spirit of the Notting Hill Carnival following the fire embodied the spirit of the community, which is also clear when going through the 999 calls which were made on that night. They came together, that community, and sought refuge in the block to the very end. They may have had the crumbs from the table of the richest borough in the country, but they were nevertheless the strongest community. As we've heard from the testimony from the family members of the bereaved, friends and members of the Grenfell community, Grenfell and the residents captured the essence of community life. Flora Nida, Saber's wife, said this: "We are a close community at Grenfell Tower, and our door was always open to our neighbours. Sadly, we have lost many friends and neighbours in the fire, including 2 young girls on our floor who would regularly come into our flat to see us." The term community is used with positive, not negative connotations, synonymous with disenfranchisement. The concept of a vertical village, we suggest, is apt, because it simply means that we are remembering a bygone age of an old-fashioned community. Grenfell was not a ghetto or an old people's home. It was a traditional community, diverse, vibrant, the loss of which is not just personal to many, but to society as a whole. For Grenfell Tower was a mirror of our society, particularly our great capital city. It was not about one particular ethnic group or class. The Grenfell Tower tragedy that has affected a wide range of people, ordinary people. Permit me to give you a few examples. Raymond Moses Bernard, whose parents were part of the Windrush generation, was from Trinidad. Marjorie Vital, flat 162, who died along with her son Ernie, they came from the Caribbean island of Dominica, which is where my father came from. Dennis Murphy was from Ireland. Mohammed Nida was from Afghanistan. Mary Mendy from the Gambia. Pilly Burton from Spain. Zainab Dean, Sierra Leone. The Shouquet family from the Lebanon. Mohammed Al-Hajj Ali from Dara, a city in southwestern Syria. Gloria Trevisan and Marco Gottardi in flat 202. They were Italian. Mohammed Khani, he was from Tehran. And Bekti Hafton was Eritrean. We agree with Mr. Imran Khan of Queen's Counsel that the terms of the inquiry should be broadened to deal with, well, some refer to it as the elephant in the room. I refer to it as the blue whale in the room. To what extent did the fact that the residents were perceived to be predominantly from poorer members of the borough contribute to this incident? That has to be looked at, sir. And sir, you cannot ignore race. The residents of Grenfell Tower and the Lancaster West estate were left isolated by central government after this fire. It is difficult to believe there could be such inhumanity. It was the people of London, not local or central government, that initially responded to Grenfell Tower tragedy. It should also not be forgotten that many people are still not housed and remain in temporary accommodation, battling with the authorities to be appropriately rehoused, and they are still being ignored. Additionally, many of the residents and survivors of the fire are and continue to suffer mental anguish and the effects of post-traumatic stress disorder caused by the horrors of the night and the aftermath of the fire. Our clients, victims, residents, the bereaved and survivors are dignified people who have maintained their dignity, sir, despite this tragedy. They have placed a lot of trust in this inquiry. That trust has been front-loaded because this inquiry has yet to properly start. But there is no reason for our clients to believe that their trust is misplaced. We are sure that you will wish to repay that trust. They are merely seeking answers from this inquiry, which will involve the asking of many difficult questions. But the asking of such questions is the very nature of the beast and purpose of the public inquiry. It is important, therefore, to recognise that this fire occurred at a time when there are issues of legal aid cuts, a time when there's an assault on rights, and even the enforcement of rights in any event. The contract between the individual and the state is based upon enforceable rights. The method of enforcement has been lost to many less wealthy individuals. The very risk of fire is a very emotive thing for everyone. That is why this tragedy hit home for so many people up and down this country. There was nothing the residents could do. The tower was meant to be building regulations compliant, but it was obviously not. This incident raises issues across the country on every building where such cladding is being used, and we support the recommendation that there be a temporary ban on anything but A1 classified external cladding on new and existing buildings. As part of its legacy, this inquiry must seek to ensure that a zero-risk approach to fire safety in tower blocks prevails. So, one of the most heartbreaking things that happened in this case is this. Some of the residents on the top floor of Grenfell Tower had disabilities. Why on earth were persons with disabilities which affected their mobility housed on the top floors, where in the event of fire there were no means of evacuation if the lifts failed? Think about it. Additionally, in terms of firefighting's response, there were no fire hoses long enough to extend from the ground to fight fires on those upper floors. Important questions to consider are, why was the refurbishment needed? Please do not misunderstand what we say about this. Everyone is entitled to a more aesthetically pleasing environment to live in. However, the question must be asked whether the refurbishment was simply about beautifying the tower. It is not lost that the building in its previous form may have been considered an eyesore to some of the more wealthier residents in the borough of Kensington and Chelsea. Sir, it is a legitimate question to ask whether money spent on the tower was not for the residents, but for some of the more wealthier people living in the borough, so that the tower was made more aesthetically pleasing to them. This is not to suggest that poor people should live in ugly blocks, but the point is beautifying at what cost. Were the materials used second rate? Yes. Everyone deserves to live in a nice home, but the way it is refurbished shows that it was not done with the welfare of the residents in mind. One of our clients, a Mr. Bonifacio, was retired. He was elderly and blind. He lived on the 11th floor, which was previously the 8th floor before the refurbishment, and he had lived there for 36 years. He could work his way around before the refurbishment. However, there was no consultation with him about his needs, no proper signage or allowance for him and his disability as part of the process of the refurbishment. On the night of the fire, his daughter rang 999 at least 4 times at 2:58 and 52 seconds, again at 3:57 and 28 seconds, at 4:41 and at 5:31. She was told to get him out if he could. Think about it. Blind, disabled. He could not, as it was. Let's reflect upon what that means. He was condemned to die. This leads to the next question. To what extent did fire safety regulations, fire safety guidance and evacuation procedure take into account the vulnerability of children, the disabled, the infirmed? 18 children died in that fire at Grenfell. The number of children who were trapped in the tower, as borne out in the 999 calls, whose ultimate fates were sealed as that fire raged, highlights the need for training, clear guidance, and strict compliance with regulations around evacuation where the vulnerable and children may be involved. We would expect the inquiry to investigate whether the fire service lacked adequate resources and direction when they intended this fire. Have cuts to the fire service or deregulation contributed to what happened last year? Take the following, namely the National Fire Training Centre, the call centre and building control, all of which are examples of the effects of deregulation which played out on the night. If it is subsequently shown to be true that deregulation had an impact and contributed to the Grenfell fire, then everyone can understand that it adds to the outrage of the voiceless, their frustration and this fire's foreseeability. People loved living in Grenfell. They were entitled to feel and to be safe there. Firefighters do an important job and often put themselves at serious risk in doing it. But if we are to expect from them to put their lives on the line for us, then the public can expect them to be trained and organised to the right and high standard and to be provided with the right equipment and resources. The public also can expect that landlords use proper building materials, that their residents are kept safe. Of course, there will always be accidents involving fire, but we can and must do more to minimise these risks. Every effort should be made to ensure that deaths by fires in these blocks are avoided. Sir, before concluding my remarks, I would wish to address you briefly on the panel. We welcome the Prime Minister's decision to appoint panel members to sit with you during phase 2 of the inquiry. Given, however, the inextricable link between the evidence which will be heard during phase 1 and phase 2 to the cause of the fire and the disaster that unfolded on the 14th of June, we say it's imperative that the panel members are appointed at the earliest opportunity to enable them to hear the evidence in phase 1. In particular, it's important that they hear the testimony of the true experts of the Grenfell fire, that's the residents and the survivors. We also press our call for the appointment of panel members with a true understanding of the ethnic and socially diverse community of Grenfell Tower. So, in concluding, our clients want the whole truth from this inquiry. If there was wrongdoing on the part of individuals, any corporate body or otherwise, from top down, they want that wrongdoing properly scrutinised, fairly examined and rightfully exposed. This should all be done in the most open way, as is possible in the context of this inquiry, without any fear or favour. They want nothing less than the complete story in relation to the circumstances as to how 72 people were killed, told in an honest and unvarnished way. Sir, if wrongdoing is found, they want you, sir, to give a full report explaining how those deaths occurred, with recommendations to prevent similar fatalities occurring again in the future. This is the price that they ask for their trust in you. The public and our clients have a right to know that these deaths and losses have not been in vain. They want this so that they can, at the very least, know that lessons have been learned, that out of this tragedy, some good may occur and hopefully prevent others from suffering the pain that they have suffered. A profound respect for the sanctity of human life underpins our system of common law, as it underpins the jurisprudence under Articles 1 and 2 of the European Convention of Human Rights. This not only means that the state must not unlawfully take life, but must also take appropriate legislative and administrative steps to protect lives. So the purpose of this investigation, if I can just outline them very quickly, to ensure, as far as possible, that the full facts are brought to light, that culpable and discreditable conduct is exposed and brought to public notice, that where there is suspicion of deliberate wrongdoing, even if it's unjustified, that is allayed. Dangerous practices and procedures are rectified, and that those who have lost their relatives may at least have the satisfaction of knowing that lessons have been learned that may save the lives of others. Accordingly, sir, you and your team carry a huge burden on your shoulders during this inquiry, and we are here to help you on that journey, to assist you to lighten your load. Let the words of the late Dr. Martin Luther King be your guiding light through this inquiry. Every step towards the goal of justice requires sacrifice, suffering, and struggle, the tireless exertions and passionate concern of dedicated individuals. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Thomas. Well, that's a convenient point to have a break, so we'll stop now and resume at 11:30. Thank you very much. Now, Mr Mansfield, you're going to make a statement as well. Yes?
Yes, thank you very much. Good morning, sir. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So what I have to say today is really the concluding remarks of the bereaved and the survivors. I, together with Alison Munro and Philip Dale, represent the G10. I'm not going to go through the list you're familiar with. But the attempt at this moment is to, in a way, reflect and to summarise and draw out themes. But I do it for a purpose. And the purpose is derived somewhat organically, very much from what has been happening over the past few weeks. Sitting there day after day, listening to accounts that you never thought would reach you as far as they did because you weren't there, and then you were there. And then you see the film, as you did. And as you remarked yesterday, it doesn't matter how many times you see the film that is extant still. It shocks. Because we all know that behind that window, someone is about to die. Now, to watch incineration, almost like a global village, go around the world, so you actually see it occurring, but those are on the ground as well. And we've heard from them all, or nearly all of them. But certainly, you may remember in a somewhat unscripted remark, an observation by Gloria, on behalf of Gloria, Emanuela Disaro said that really she came without intending to say anything, but she felt the pain in the room. We all felt the pain in the room. The pain compelled her to speak. The pain compelled her to say, in fact, I don't need to describe Gloria because you all have. You've described Gloria, parts of Gloria. She was trapped on the top floor because she couldn't get out. The gate was locked, along with many others who had been advised to go to the top and were left there. And as she also said, movingly, I don't bear hatred. I haven't come here to impart bitterness. I am angry. In fact, they were all angry in their own way, and that's a perfectly fair, legitimate response to a situation that they face. What they want is that anger to be harnessed by you and also everyone else to reach the truth. Well, that's an easy sort of statement to make in one sense. Of course, accomplishing it and achieving it is quite another. But the response that she made, the anger that she felt, we would all hope infuses our objectives. And I want to stand back and ask, perhaps on behalf of the families and the bereaved, for you to consider something which really hasn't been done in the past. And it arises because of that feeling of anger they all have, to take you back to last June and July. Because the force of the event, which has caused that anger, quite rightly, led to an immediate reaction by the Prime Minister. You were very swiftly appointed to chair an inquiry. And the Prime Minister was anxious to ensure that the public were aware that there was going to be no stone left unturned to reach the truth. So there's the inquiry, as it were, commencing, in a sense, on that day, almost the day after. And then within a month or so, a bit less, you had recommended terms of reference, which had been accepted. I'll come back to them right at the end. And you did an opening of the inquiry last September. So there was at that point an alacrity. There was a momentum, there was an impetus, because everybody recognised urgency in relation to this issue. And it's that urgency that I would put as a context for the suggestions that I have about the approach from now on. And of course, after that, or at least at that time, but after it as well, you yourself, quite naturally, and we say quite rightly, you were hoping to have the interim report done by Easter that's just gone by. And yet, we haven't started even the evidence. Now, this is not a criticism. It is in the attempt to forge out of these circumstances a rekindling of the need for urgency and the need for action. And the problem, if your inquiry takes the normal course, is that that anger and that need will become dissipated, and like so many other inquiries of reference has already been made, the risks are that it gets lost in the long grass, which would no doubt please a large number of people who have a lot to lose. But in a sense, reassurance to the public of the anguish that you felt over these 2 weeks and the anger that the families felt, the way in which that reassurance can be resurrected, and as you know, that is not an easy task, is in a number of ways. But the first way is, in fact, for the public on whose behalf you act, as well as the families, do not have to wait for recommendations that are obvious. Now, I appreciate, as do we all, that the common approach, by which I mean the usual approach, is for part one of an inquiry to have findings of fact. And in a sense, I appreciate that's what you had intended to do, and still intend to do. And of course, you were commissioned, as it were, in the terms of reference and the letter of reference, to make findings of fact as soon as possible and make recommendations. Now, if it takes the usual course, then the question of recommendations might not arise in the Part 1 report. The interim report will have a statement of facts. So the first point we would make is, would you kindly reconsider that division? And we say reconsideration is essential because of the matters I'm going to put before you this morning, many of which have already been traversed. And I have no intention of a delay and repetition where it can be avoided, but on occasion I will have to touch on subjects that have been covered. And of course you had our written opening, and most of those points have been made, so I'm not going to rehearse what's in the written opening except one or two passages which haven't been touched on. Therefore, if you're prepared to consider recommendations at a much earlier stage, that in itself will encourage, one hopes encourage, those who've remained studiously silent in relation to these events. And in a sense, the recommendations that we suggest you might like to consider at an earlier stage, we say shouldn't even wait for the interim report. Now, why do we say that? Because the interim report at the moment, with all best efforts, and we do appreciate that a lot of work has been done by you and by your team assembling materials. We would like you to capitalize on that work, obviously in public, over the next 1 or 2 months. But, for example, it might be possible by the summer for you to begin to indicate or actually make recommendations which relate to the most obvious concerns that have already been raised by other representatives of the families. I will obviously spell out what they are and why we say you're in a position to do that. So in other words, the statute does not prohibit you from making recommendations where you consider that they are vital for the safety of the nation, at least, and certainly all those who live in tower blocks, whether they're social housing or not. Because that's the big need. That's the big concern that people have day in, day out when they wake up. Am I going to wake up alive or dead? And this is not fantasy. It's not fantasy for the families who've been through it, as you've heard, and it's not fantasy for those who've been through it vicariously because they've watched it. So that sort of reassurance would be welcomed, one would hope, by the Prime Minister and her various departments, as well as by the public. May I give you one illustration, just one illustration, of why we say this is actually an imperative. In the case, and I hesitate because Hillsborough is constantly brought up, but it is an example. In the case of Hillsborough, Lord Justice Taylor held an inquiry, a public inquiry, within a month or so of what happened on the terraces, which of course everyone in this room and elsewhere is familiar with. But what he did, one of the things he did, I leave out all the things that didn't happen, but one of the things that did happen was a sea change in the way in which crowd safety was approached. He didn't wait. He didn't want the government to wait. The whole thing was transformed by the beginning of the next season, which was only months away. So it's possible. And of course, people know what the sea change was. It's all seating instead of standing. Now, that was a massive injection of money to change a culture which had grown up, a word that, in fact, Lord Justice Taylor used in relation to Hillsborough, of, in a sense, a culture of indifference had grown up there. But he cut through that. And he said, this is what's going to happen if you're going to encourage safety, set the agenda, set the tone. And we would suggest, humbly, of course, that you might consider that in relation to the issues I want to raise. And may I just follow on from my colleague's recent statement, Leslie Thomas and the panel. I wanted to touch on it at the end, but I'll touch on it now. We would ask that whoever is going to be appointed, and it, as far as I know, no one has been, the 2 extra panel members. I pause for a moment. Extremely important. This too, rather like the pen portraits, was something that had to be argued for. We are grateful that the Prime Minister, because we realise it's not within your behest, the Prime Minister eventually agreed. It took too long for that decision. A decision that could have been made months ago. One wonders, was it because of pressure? Was it because of a judicial review? What do the families have to do to get very simple aspects of reassurance and public confidence? Well, it's happened. But it could have happened quicker, but it's not too late, we say, if you were prepared. I appreciate it's not for you to actually appoint them, but if they could be appointed to deal with evidence from now on, that they sit alongside you, because you may now see, and no one would be critical of any of us not seeing before the pen or personal portraits of the last 2 weeks, just how deep-seated and far-flung the issues are. And as has been stated by others, this is not an inquiry about a refrigerator or anything else of that dimension. It is much bigger, and you will have noticed that, of course, much of the opening that has been put before you has in fact embraced the issues. So did the families that are social issues, social housing, and it's, as it were, tentacles that reach out into the community. Therefore, we say the 2 extra panel members are not because you can't do the job. No one's saying that. What one's saying is this requires, from the beginning, a diversity of panel that again has the confidence of the public and the families, looking at everything, including the possibility of early recommendations. And of course that, in one breath also, includes the suggestion yesterday from Mr. Khan for broadening the terms of reference. Again, that was another argument put forward on behalf of the families that at that time, for reasons, one's not saying there weren't reasons, it was thought at that time that it wasn't appropriate. But flexibility is important. And you may think that a reconsideration of that term of reference at this juncture, having now heard the families and having heard openings on their behalf, that in fact it would assist both you to have the panel members and the terms extended to deal with these particular aspects. Now, what are the areas, and I'm going to focus on a few areas, which we say are susceptible to early recommendation without waiting for an interim report that might itself not have recommendations. Now, the timeline here is such that I hope I'm not stepping out of line entirely here, that on the dates we were given by your council a day or so ago, it doesn't look as though you'd be in a position to have the Part 1 interim until perhaps the beginning of next year. I hope that's a fair assessment. Therefore, if it only contains findings of fact, which cannot obviously be minimised, but if that's going to concentrate on that, the phase 2, which obviously it broadens out into areas of recommendation and accountability and so on, was it fair to say it might be another year after that before you get the report which really the families are waiting for? They want to know what happened, but they actually want to know, of course, why it happened. That's linked to how it happened. And therefore, if that time frame is right, it's too long. Again, not critical, it's not casting blame, it's just saying the process will take too long. This requires an exceptional approach of being willing to say, well, there are certain things as I go along, or we, if there's a panel alongside you at the time, we can see the merits of having these recommendations spelt out now, because of course much of your work's been in the public domain anyway, by other groups of people issuing reports left, right and centre. There's hardly a day that goes by in which the media haven't got hold of a report, although we are cautious because the media can get it wrong, as Rajiv graphically demonstrated. May I then just pause before indicating the areas where we suggest early recommendations would be welcome. And there are essentially 3 that I'm going to concentrate on. One relates to the culture. The culture of compliance is one way it's been put by Stephanie Barwise, and I'm going to use the word mindset. The need for a paradigm shift in mindset and approach to home safety. In another sense, I suppose it's Leslie Thomas's point about ensuring that at the end of the day there should be a right to home safety and security, because it can't be more basic than that. So the first area I want to ask you to consider is ways in which the mindset, which is undoubtedly there to this day, can be changed and influenced, and what can be done now to begin the process. That's the first one. The second area is identifiable safety measures that can be recommended now. We do not have to wait until the end for some of these to be considered. That is the negative and the positive, the removal of items and the insertion of others, measures. The third area is the stay put policy. So those are the three areas where we say some recommendations can be made well in advance of the next 2 years, and we don't need to wait. Now, in relation, therefore, to the first area, what has been called as I say, culture of compliance. Really, I am going to read what is the introduction to our written opening statement. It's one of the few things I wish to read, because before I read it, may I say, it beggars belief. The last time I read it, and I've only read it once, I asked those who heard it whether they knew anything about it. And it was interesting how few people had recognized that something of this nature had happened. It happened on the very morning of June the 14th, 2017, the day of the fire. While Grenfell Tower was still slow burning, an exclusive government-backed group of senior, high-profile grandees from the world of politics and business had arranged a meeting of experts to discuss the subject of cladding. The group was known as RTI, Red Tape Initiative. They had convened a few months earlier, in April 2017. The group's objectives were clear: to dismantle European Union regulations that were considered a hindrance to profit-making. On May the 10th, 2017, RTI produced a document entitled "The European Union's Impact on the United Kingdom Housing and Construction Industry." The group zeroed in on the Construction Products Regulation, the numbers given, intended to harmonise the quality of construction materials, including external cladding, across the European Union to ensure safety. This was a regulation designed to limit the generation and spread of fire and smoke, a regulation that has direct relevance for fires such as the one at Grenfell Tower. Such was the thinking of the dominant power brokers during the dying embers of Grenfell Tower. In this atmosphere, safety regulation was sneered at as red tape folly and dismissed as expensive and burdensome. Put simply, the prevailing orthodoxy was one of profit before safety, effectively profit before people. Now, one couldn't have made that up at all. It is incredible that on that day there were a group of people central to our society who had the arrogance and had the feeling of immunity and impunity that they could gather together to actually undermine safety because of those factors, some social, some economic, some political. I don't need to go further. That illustrates graphically how serious the problem was and still is. And we say it still is because they're all sitting here, not the ones from the Red Tape Initiative, but the mindset sitting here, not essentially cooperating with this inquiry. Essentially, hostility to regulation, hostility to admission. And we say that your inquiry is not going to founder on what they do, but our society requires an industry and a political class that are prepared to acknowledge failings, accept responsibility, and, of course, here, disclose what has gone wrong, where it's gone wrong, when it went wrong, and who was responsible. That has got to be a matter not just for you to dig around and find, but for them who sit here to answer. And it's a pity, in a way, if I digress for a moment, that the personal portraits that you kindly organised elsewhere weren't all in the same place. In other words, they might have benefited from an opening followed by the personal portraits such that those who are being reluctant, reticent, passing the buck, whatever they're intending to do, could have seen the results of what happened in this tinderbox that they were responsible for at least refurbishing and in other respects. So that we commend what happened in the last 2 weeks. It's been seen as a model of the future. We would ask that it is regarded as a model for the future, but in future, we would ask that it's all one venue, all one time, everybody is gathered together because it's equally part of the evidence, what happened over the last 2 weeks. It's not merely, obviously, a memorial. It is people living saying, I've had people have lost their lives, but my life has been lost. And it's only when you realise that all record of their lives has gone because the photographs that were in the flat, they've all been burnt. There's nothing left. And then you realise. And then one would hope that the government agencies and the corporates would begin, and I'm sure underneath there's a conscience lurking somewhere waiting to get out, that they would respond to this situation. However, enough on that particular thing, because unless that happens, there will be no change from that industry. And we say there has to be change of that kind. Now, what's the recommendation? Well, we say there are two possible ways forward under this heading. One is that so far the procedure, whether it's position statements or openings, hasn't actually produced much fruit in terms of the admissions or acceptance or any of it, as has been rehearsed many times before you. You've asked for a response by September, and I think as was said earlier on by Mr. Friedman, it's a rather generous extension of time. The first point we suggest, this is internally, is that they are not left until the end of September. They've had long enough already. They must know what their positions are. They know full well what their positions are. They don't want to declare them, but we suggest a little bit of nudging and help from yourself might just encourage them. They might also be encouraged if they know that at this stage you are minded to make certain recommendations. Now, either they're going to be a party to those or they're not. One of the recommendation in this area, we say, is an obvious one. Essentially, the construction industry had become deregulated. There were regulations, but they weren't interested, and they paid no attention. In fact, the few that were there, they wanted to dismantle. So therefore, were you minded to make a recommendation by the summer which is not outlandish, which is not fantasy, which is not something which is unrealistic, that the government considers a regulatory authority. Now, the Hackett Review suggests this, but it's not gone far enough. The industry can't be left to self-regulate. We know where that would end up, and another red tape initiative. So it can't be the industry. It's got to be an independent, we say, an independent regulator with essentially a department which includes the inspection, investigation and enforcement of a regime of regulation, which I'm not going into what the regime should include, what the statute should include. I'm suggesting that at this stage, if the government's put on red alert that they need to be thinking about how to do this as a backup to the Hackett, but going a little review, but going perhaps a little further, that might encourage some hands to be put, oh, we don't need that. Oh, why don't we need it? Because, and then they might just slip into the possibility of describing why they want it the way it is. So that's two of the points that we would make under the first heading of changing the mindset and essentially the regime of non-compliance with regulation. May I then move to safety measures, that heading. Now again, I don't want to repeat all the many points that have been made in considerable detail about the way in which the fire spread. I'm going to, as it were, home in on some extremely important points which we say relate to urgency. In other words, the need for some recommendations to be made straight away. And again, it perhaps doesn't need to be underlined, but on the other hand, maybe it does. In fact, so far as we can ascertain, at the moment, in relation to blocks that have failed government fire tests, now of course there's a question on even whether the tests are sufficiently stringent, but on the ones that are there are 306 blocks in the United Kingdom, existing blocks. And according to Theresa May and her department, recently in May, 158 of those are social housing blocks. And of the 158, 104, they've started removing the cladding. Now, we say it just emphasises it's too slow. It's too slow for this to be happening in this way. And once again, one has a very interesting little cameo of what's going on in the wings, even when it comes to the removal, never mind prohibition. What happens? Because some of these states are in London. They're not all outside London. Some of them, and I put in the written argument where the ones are in London. What is beginning to happen? I don't think a person in this room can't guess. The owners are saying, ooh, not us. Management. Management is saying, no, it's the owners. Sometimes they won't even reveal who the owner is. It's the owners. And then they both get together and sit down around the table, no, we'll pass it over to the tenants. And so they're saying that the tenants have got to pay. So in steps Theresa May saying, right, well, it's taken all this time for this to come forward. This is only last week or the week before. No, we're going to provide 400 million to assist people to remove cladding. And we're still talking about whether to ban it or not? Well, I'll come to that. However, we now learn that the 400 million promised is not coming from a defence budget or somewhere else. It's coming out of the social housing budget, such that it is now being suggested the level of social housing will be affected by removing that sum of money. Then they go the next day and say, no, it won't. I'm not interested in the ins and outs. What one is interested in, action should have been taken before. It hasn't been. It's led to arguments about responsibility, and that cannot be countenanced a day longer if you were minded, never mind the removal, to look at high-rise residents, and I'm focusing on high-rise residents. Now, I mention it also in the same breath because sometimes one isn't totally aware of what's going on around you. But very recently, something called New London Architecture, NLA, I have to confess, not on everyone's lips, but nevertheless, has produced some very interesting figures. And there is an explosion at this moment of high-rise building in London, never mind outside London. This is just London. There are 455 projected projects in 2016. Now it's gone up to a record 510 high-rise buildings. That's high-rise as a whole. Over 20 stories. Think about this. It's Leslie Thomas's favourite phrase. Think about it. This is not just this is a situation where we're putting up buildings where we know we can't fight fires. Over 20 stories. At the moment, I'll come to what's possible. So if we are contemplating, and some of these are already under construction and some of them are residential. There's one in the Isle of Dogs, I can give the names if necessary, but there are two particular ones. One's 233 metres high. It's more than 3 times the height, this residential building, of the one that you're dealing with at Grenfell. And another one, the name of which I can give if necessary, is 235 metres high. So therefore, there is undoubtedly a need, as these buildings go up and before they're completed, to ensure, when we say this is where it becomes extremely important, it's important that combustible material, whether it's cladding or insulation or an envelope or other materials being used, are not used. It is of A1 importance that you have non-combustible. And one doesn't want to have scholastic arguments like how many angels on the head of a pin? Well, non-combustible, is it limited combustibility? No combustibility. However expensive that becomes, no combustibility in relation to high-rise residents, and one would hope others as well. And at this moment, I think it's today, this very day, the Royal Borough of Kensington, and if there's someone here, they can probably correct me, are voting, as I speak, on whether to replace fire doors so that you've got more resistant doors than the 15-minute ones that were in place. Now, whether that vote takes place or whether it's passed, I know not. But it's taken a year to work out that the doors need to be replaced. I just put it there because if one needs any kind of illustration of the imperative need to address these issues now. So we would say, given, of course, again, in the wings you've got the Hackett, it didn't go as far any more than it did on regulation. If you're minded to consider the possibility of recommending to the government, as they are presently floundering about whether they should ban it or not, you can see that the need, at least for a moratorium, as Mr. Sain said earlier on. Now, I want in this context, if I may, there is another reason why this is all extremely important. Because, of course, it's possible to say, well, you know, we didn't really know about this. Well, this is where we take issue a little. I'm not sure that we do fundamentally with Mr. Millett's opening, because he said something of considerable interest, not more than one thing, of considerable interest. But in relation to the nature of the fire, he used the words extraordinary, agreed. He also used the word unprecedented, agreed. I'll come to 2 examples in a moment. Also, he says, of course, no fire officer, and we can understand from the statements, will come along and say that they've experienced it. But he quite rightly said, that's not the question. That's not the question. The question is, was it foreseeable? Which he said, I think, he was going to come back to. But he didn't. I'm not saying on purpose. We all forget things. I shall probably forget quite a bit in this. However, Foreseeability, we say, is extremely central because it was foreseeable. Now, the two events that he cited, I think he did, others have. Second World War, well, looking around the room, I'm about the only one who can remember the Blitz, probably. Now, I'm not going into that. And I don't expect fire officers to remember the Blitz, obviously, where there were buildings on fire. But then Piper Alpha, now that's extremely important. Coincidence. Coincidence. Yesterday. In Aberdeen, as we hold our meeting here, there is another meeting going on. It is convened by the oil and gas industry, and it's their annual safety conference. And it's 30 years since Piper Alpha. 30 years since an explosion in which 167 workers died in 22 minutes. Unprecedented. That's not the question. Do we have to wait until trucks mow people down in the street before you think about a pedestrian crossing? No. Do you have to wait until you stick your hand in the fire to know you're going to get burnt? No. So we have to have a slightly different approach. And what was interesting was that the keynote speaker yesterday was Lord Cullen himself. And what they had to say, in fact, they did reference, he didn't, but the opening was in these words by the Health and Safety Executive. We owe it to those who have lost lives, to ourselves, to revisit what we know works, apply it to the changing operation and environment we find ourselves in today. And what he was referring to, and Lord Cullen referred to as a headline issue, that particular disaster was because management didn't know or were uninterested and indifferent to managing risk and ignoring the warning signs in relation to a fire they thought was impossible, in relation to a fire which they thought if it took place they couldn't evacuate, and so on. So there were no contingencies. So what they are saying up in Scotland at this minute is that the lessons that were, in fact, learnt from that disaster, it's not about an oil rig any more than a refrigerator, it's about the principles of a culture of safety in which, and the issues that have come up are exactly the issues here. A lack of training, the question of the risk element not being sufficiently, smoke hazards, evacuate, all the same issues came up on that platform as are now coming here. So we say that example, which is being, as it were, rolled out again as we speak, is one that we would urge you to, if you haven't already, to examine that original report so that those who forget the lessons of the past don't have to relive them. However, I can do the next part of this same section. In other words, the foreseeability producing the urgency for recommendations now. And can I just run through them relatively quickly? First of all, you've already heard, and I'm not going to repeat it, Stephanie Barwise's examples of fires in the 1990s, that you've also heard from Sam Seen about the Scotland experience, you've heard from Pete Weatherby about a table of other fires, it's all there. We've put in our argument some examples of academic prophecy, unfortunately indicating that something of this kind would happen. It's in our paragraph 17. I don't rehearse those as well. But I do pause for a moment on two examples that we do place considerable reliance on. And these examples produce the need, we say, for early, and the possibility for early recommendations of an obvious kind, which in this case relates to combustibles. Lacanau, that is the Lacanau fire, and both examples are London-based. It's the London Fire Brigade. And it's Londoners who watch it. One of them was virtually next door to Grenfell Tower, just down the road in Shepherd's Bush. However, this one, Lacanau, July the 3rd, 2009. These two have remarkable similarities. This one relating to, again, an older block of flats, came out of a fault in a television on the 9th floor. So again, it's a domestic utility item. The block was 14 stories high, built in 1958. But there was a detailed narrative because the exterior cladding panels burnt through in 4.5 minutes. No, not the whole building. But you need the whole building before you begin to realize the possibilities that have to be countenanced. In other words, as the Cullen experience was, you have to think the impossible as far as safety is concerned. Now, I just want, it's 22.4 in our own opening. There was this detailed narrative delivered by the jury. Now, they're going to be wasting their time if, in fact, nobody's going to pick up and run with it. If nobody in government, if nobody in public service actually pays any attention, then the jury might as well go home and not bother. But we say we set tremendous store by inquests and by juries who take the time in the public interest to detail what's what. The detailed narrative verdict delivered by the jury determined that the fire spread up into flat 79, where the deaths occurred, through the panels under the bedroom windows of flat 79. This is all very familiar. The aluminium frames having been distorted by flames from flat 65, creating gaps. These gaps permitted smoke to be pushed back into flat 79. This led to rapid and extensive smoke logging. The composite panels were replacements carried out during refurbishment. Now, in fact, they came up with another very important point. This is the jury in the Lakanal case. Stay put was a central issue in the Lakanal inquest, that policy. The jury found that existing training documents were contradictory and inconsistent, particularly in regard to either staying put or getting out when there is a fire in the building. The coroner also remarked upon insufficient clarity and recommended that the Department of Communities and Local Government publish consolidated national guidelines in relation to the stay put policy, including how such guidance is disseminated to residents. Now that's, as it were, historic, but within geographic and temporal reach of what happened at Grenfell, and it is, we say, a betrayal of what that jury and our system was doing in order to put things right. The coroner completed a Rule 43 report for the Secretary of State, so government can't say they didn't know about this. And in fact, it was on, and the importance of these two is they were on television. You can still see, if you Google both of them, graphic illustrations of the flames and the smoke outside the building. All right, not the whole building, but you can see the possibility. And the coroner was wanting to say, and did say in her Rule 43, awareness that fire can spread downwards and laterally and above and adjacent to a fire flat, and that insecure compartmentation can permit transfer of smoke and fire between a flat and common parts, putting the lives of residents and others at risk. What more has to be said? That is a flag-waving exercise of a major kind. And yet, here we are, spending, 2 years to discover what we say is obvious and should have been acted on before and has not been. So the Lakanal fire is extremely important, but also Shepherd's Court, which was August of the year before 2016, an 18-story 1970s tower block. It started in the kitchen. Again, a resonance with this case. From a faulty tumble dryer on the 7th floor, it spread over 5 floors. Not all the floors, but 5 floors. What do people need? An absolute model in which it is shown that it can spread to the 6th, the 7th, the 8th, unless. We say these were the warning signs, besides all the people who'd spoken out, which we've set out in our the various openings, besides all the people who've spoken out, and of course there's one group we rightly name as the experts, that's the families, who've been speaking out since the beginning. How much more is needed? We say not much more in order to come to a conclusion that combustibles, at least, should be either subject to a moratorium or banned. And in relation to this particular fire, the Shepherd's Court fire, which spread over 5 floors, here cladding was susceptible to intense heat when the polystyrene foam filter melted, showing metal and wood surrounds to fall away, which accelerates rapid spread of fire. The Assistant Commissioner of Fire Safety Regulation, Dan Daly, as has already been indicated, wrote about it in this way, and also letters were sent to 33 different councils. Again, this has been mentioned before, but I just want to go back to the letter that he wrote about this fire. I am drawing this fire to your attention to highlight the external spread of the fire that occurred. My predecessor, Assistant Commissioner Steve Turek, wrote to housing providers in March 2009, so again, well before Grenfell, about a variety of matters. One of those was replacement double glazing and the associated replacement of spandrel and filler panels on the external faces of blocks of flats with floors above 18 metres in height. In this case, we believe such panels were a contributory factor to the external fire spread. Because it's in some way a contributory factor, you don't do anything about it? We say, of course you do. And the letter has this other paragraph. Again, we've set it out, but I would like to highlight it. In the light of fires that have occurred, I would urge you to consider carefully your arrangements for specifying, monitoring and improving all aspects of future replacement and improvement to building facades. Contracts for the provision and installation of replacement elements of building facades, including insulation replacement, double glazing, associated spandrel and infill panels, must ensure compliance with all parts of Part B if they are to secure safety. So there was considerable emphasis put as a result of that fire, which again, no doubt the occupants of Grenfell, if they go and shop anywhere near Shepherd's Bush, would, that day it was very clearly seen by people in the vicinity, very clearly seen on television. So these were well publicised events, and clearly the detail of them was well known in the sense that it was proselytised by a number of people. But that group that I mentioned, that have been, I've left them to last because, in fact, they're the most important of this group of warnings. And it's interesting that the blogger called his blog, I think, Playing with Fire. So that essentially, everybody who lived there knew there were risks. They may not have known exactly what the risks were, but there were things going wrong, whether they're surges or other electrical difficulties. And plainly, they had been asking about the fire resistance of materials and so on, not getting answers and being precluded. So they knew, and as they said on the recent demonstration, both outside the House of Commons and elsewhere on the 14th of June this year, we don't want to wait another 30 years. We don't want more people going up and dying in this way, waiting for, as it were, changes. We would like there to be a ban, and some of them saying, what about sprinklers, which were very much part of the Lacanal recommendations as well. So that in relation, therefore, to the need, I hope we've established it. And one of the families that you heard about last week, that I represent, the Murphy family, it's a simple thing like this that you then realise you've got to do something about this. Dennis Murphy had to join a trade union in order to get his voice heard, not just heard, but maybe taken notice of. He wasn't a bus driver, he couldn't even drive a car, so it was said. That they have to go to these lengths in present-day society, that the mechanisms, well, you don't need mechanisms, you need humanity, you need the ability of those in authority and in power to implement safety, to not only listen but actually react and respond, which is what we're waiting for here today still. Reaction and response of substance, which is yet to happen. So we say there's an overwhelming case for making some recommendations on that score, that is just to do with combustibles. However, we say as a second half of this particular topic, other measures that can be taken. Again, I'll try and do them quickly. I put them into internal lectures. These are totally practical. Totally practical. And the families, not me, the families have been saying this. Internally, you might like to consider as we go through, sprinklers inside and out. Yes, it's not going to stop this fire, but that's not the point. Again, it's missing the point. If every time you come, this is so bad, that wouldn't work. It's a combination, it's an attitude to safety, which Lord Cullen yesterday said needs to be imbued back into our society and our system. So sprinklers. Now this is, I don't think anybody's mentioned it. If they have, please forgive me and I've overlooked it. Fire extinguishers. I mean, is this something that's so unusual? Listening to Rajiv Menon's description of what his client had to go through, he goes to in the middle of the night to the kitchen, he sees smoke, but no flames at that point. And he leaves and he does, as we've heard, he alerts everyone else. But the flames and the taking hold of the fire, I don't know what the interval of time is, but it's sometime he's outside and he sees it coming out of his window. Had each flat or each floor been endowed with a fire extinguisher? What's so wrong with that? What's so expensive about that as another means? So, again, one needs to be asking the experts who are coming, I know next week for presentations and later for questions. And we would say these are questions we would like asked, and possibly with supplementaries asked by us and the initial question by your counsel. Now, HR packs, what are they? Well, an HR pack, and I'll confess I didn't know that the air industry had examined this earlier, but it's a high-rise pack just for high-rises over, well, so the definitions change. Some say 10 floors, others say 18, some say 20. But in any event, I don't quibble about the number of floors. A high-rise pack that should be present in every high-rise flat over the certain level, and it includes very simple things. A mask. What was happening? They were putting wet towels over their faces and trying all sorts of ways in which they might alleviate the problem. But that would contain a proper mask, some of them with some sort of breathing apparatus, but that may be more difficult. A mask might be enough just to get them down the stairs. A torch, because the lights go out and you need a torch to get down the stairs. These are simple. Will they do them? No, there's always a reserve. We're not sure that it really is that effective. If you take anything in isolation, of course, it's not going to be the answer. But somebody needs to stand back and say, and I would submit to you now, that these practical resolutions are not going to shake the world, but they could shake the world of safety to the extent that people feel reassured. What about, I gather there were ones, hose reels. You used to get those on buildings where the hoses are twiddled around and you plug them into wet risers that are already there, not dry risers. Now, maybe you don't get the tenants to do that, but they're there to help the fire brigade who haven't got hoses long enough to get to the top floors. So you have one that connects to the wet riser that goes up to that floor. And again, these are all matters which, of course, in themselves don't provide a panacea, but they do provide, as it were, incremental resolution of the problem. Now, automated fire alarms for the whole building, automated fire smoke detectors for the whole building, and an automatic extractor system on every floor, not only operated on the floor in which the fire has appeared, and that it's automated by a level of either smoke or fire that is detected in the building as a whole. Fire doors I've touched on, and a public address system so that the people on the outside or even at the bottom of the building can address everybody in every flat about what's going on and what to do. Instead of which, what did we have? Mobile phones, knocking on doors, ringing call centres, total chaos in relation to that. These are all points that could be made by the summer and have been made repeatedly by the families. Now, I didn't turn to the outside of the building. If it is to be said, you can't get a set of ladders to go up 20 stories or whatever, I understand that, but it might be impossible. Well, then you need, of course, better fire provision inside in relation to construction and so on, and I've already dealt with combustible materials. But if you can't have that, then you really do need to start thinking laterally. And whenever this seems to get raised with experts, they raise their eyes to the ceiling as if to say that we've arrived from Mars. Well, perhaps I have, I don't know, but not by helicopter. The fact is, helicopters The only question that was asked in relation to that is, did the police helicopter exacerbate by encouraging people to go in one direction or another? No, the police helicopter, in fact, at the end of the day, took some interesting photographs. What the families want to know is, could a helicopter have rescued people from the top floor had there been a system in which they could get onto the roof of the building? So even though we're dealing with Grenfell, this is important for other people. Can helicopters play a role? Which they do in other jurisdictions. That's one thing, putting out the fire, as well as rescuing. So it's two functions in relation to helicopters and aerial support and aerial platforms. So that these, again, need to be canvassed. And then one of the families, and of course I have seen it elsewhere, and you think about it, there were people jumping out of windows. Now, I'm not saying, no one's saying that the production of a soft landing inflatable, or sometimes called a rescue blanket or whatever, at the bottom of the building, all of this requires access, which of course, that is another question I'll have to look at in relation to Grenfell. But if you're making recommendations about what should be happening in relation to high-rise residences, we say that the collective memory of all these events, plus looking very carefully at the exact happenings as you're going to in these coming weeks, you should be in a position by the summer to, as it were, place on record certain focused, identified recommendations that are not going to, as it were, burst financial dams. Now, so I see the time. I think I've got, if I may have just a few more minutes, I can finish before lunch.
We'll have to finish by or very shortly after 12:45.
Yes, I'll finish in that time. May I then, the third area, because it's not making sense to divide it up, that I wanted to focus upon in relation to this is evacuation. A lot's been said about it. And we've put in our submissions, very interestingly, going back, well, again, question of personal memory, there used to be a public service advertisement by fire services which was get out, stay out, get the fire brigade out. I can't remember the song that goes with it, but that was the general deployment. And in fact, if you look on a number of websites right now, you will see that is the advice that's being given by certain fire authorities north of Watford are saying exactly that. So what have we got now? A situation in which people in buildings don't know whether they've got to get out or they're not getting out, even in relation to the Royal Borough of Kensington. They've suspended stay put, or have they? In the same breath, they're saying, no, stay put still remains as a policy. So if you're in a high-rise building, of which there are a number near Grenfell, although not all of them have got cladding on, I would submit at the moment, nobody knows what on earth they're going to do, whether they should get out or not get out. And it's had a deal of publicity already. And we would say, given that this was at the centre of Lacanal as well, you have an opportunity, which others may be missing, that's their responsibility, but we suggest you should take advantage of the situation in order to ensure there is clarification about this policy so that people who live in high-rise over a certain number of stories know whether they should remain or get out. It's a simple point. I don't elaborate it. I'm sure that it's made very clearly. So we say that's a third area where you can make suggestions that are constructive. And if I may end by indicating, it really goes back to the point about human rights and the way in which the residents regarded themselves as a community, and in a sense, a united nation. This was on the fencing outside Grenfell. I know you've been there and you've seen all the memorabilia that's been put up, photographs and so on, but this particular one caught attention. And it was an inscription from the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They're endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. That was Grenfell, And we ask that that spirit is engendered by your inquiry and the possibility of early recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mansfield. Well, we'll break at that point, resume at 2 o'clock when we'll hear from Mr. Maxwell Scott. Could I just ask that you do your best to be back here for a prompt start? We lost a bit of time in the middle of the morning when we had our earlier break, and as far as possible, we don't want to lose time because the danger is that we'll either go on too long or people will lose part of their opportunity to address us. So prompt start at 2 o'clock, please. Thank you very much.